السلام عليكم يا خشميسيز حرمتلي طلب الله العزيز لار. How are you today? We are going to continue one of the topics in our macroeconomics course about the open economy. As you remember in the chapter 3, we talk about the closed economy model as we omitted the net exports from the output equation or the GDP equation. And only depends on the consumption, government spending, and the investment. But now in this new model, in open economy, as there is international trade, exchange, exports and imports, and so on. Also, the international capital outflow in the savings and investment and so on. We saw in the first section in this chapter, we talk about the trade balance and the difference between exports and imports. When the exports are more than the imports, we have a trade surplus. When the imports is more than the exports, so we have a trade deficit. So the trade balance is about the difference between the exports and imports, and when they are equals, the exports and imports, so we have the trade is balanced. We take some preliminaries or how can the national income identity in the new model or the open economy model, as we see the GDP or the total output is equal the consumption plus the investment plus the government spending and the net exports. If we rearrange this equation, we can see that the net exports, when we move it to the left side, so the net exports will equal the output minus these three variables or this total or domestic spending. So according to this, we saw that also the net capital outflow, when we talk about the savings and the investments, the difference between them, savings minus the investments, results for the net capital outflow. So these two things are related, as we saw in the previous section, as we know here the link between them, the trade and the capital outflow. When we talk about trade, we're talking about export and import of goods and services. When we talk about capital outflow, we mean the savings and investments. So when rearranging the output equation, we saw that the net exports equals the output minus the total spendings, and also the net exports according to this will equal the output minus the consumption minus the government spending, which is also the same thing or the same meaning of the savings, as the Y is for the total income. When you minus the consumption or the government spending, so the remaining amount of money will be the saving minus the investment, so you have the net capital outflow. And the same thing at the above equation, the trade balance, so we can see the relation between them, the trade balance equals the net capital outflow. So according to this, we will move to the next section of the saving and investment in a small open economy. As we saw in the in this, we will see in this section, we examine the determinants of these international flows. How can they be determined? As we developed a model of a small open economy that corresponds to our model of the closed economy in chapter 3. So this model shows the factors that determine whether a country is a borrower or a lender in the world markets, and how policies at home and or abroad affect the flows of the capital and the goods. So in an open economy version of the loanable funds model from the chapter 3, this includes many of the same elements as the production function. As you know, the total output or production is determined by the amount of capital and the amount of labor that you use. So the output is a function of the capital and labor. Also, the consumption function, which is the total income minus the taxes, and according to the income that you earn when you minus the taxes from this income, so you will consume by the remaining amount of money. Also the investment function, which is determined by R, which is the interest rate. According to the rate of the interest rate, you are going to invest and so on. So as we know, the when the interest rate increases, so you are willing to save money. You will deposit your money on banks or buy bonds and so on, as the interest rate or the profits for these savings is increasing. On the other side, the investment will decrease because you will take a loan and the interest rate is like the price of this loan or the cost of this loan. So when the interest rate increases, the investment demand will decrease because the cost increased. And we have also the exogenous policy variables, which are determined by the physical policy of the economy of the country. The government spending or the taxes is a constant or fixed at this model. So as we know, the national saving or the supply of the loanable funds. The loanable funds, as you said, the funds that can be loaned. So the supply of these loanable funds is the savings, how much the individuals supply the economy with funds that can be lent again to the investors. So this is the savings is the supply curve, as we can see, which is also fixed. Why? As we see that savings is equal to the income minus the consumption minus the government spending, and the remaining of this equation it will be the savings. The remaining amount of money will be as savings. So the savings in this case determined by the amount of consumption and the amount of government spending. So it is fixed. As we saw in chapter 3, the national saving doesn't depend on the interest rate, which is R on the vertical axis. No, as we said, it is not determined by the interest rate like the investment, but in this case, it's determined by the amount of income and consumption and government spending. So as any model in macroeconomics, we have some assumptions. In this model, we assume that the domestic and the foreign bonds are perfect substitutes. Yani there is no difference. Domestic bonds and foreign bonds are same risk, have the same risk and the same maturity, and so on. Also, the perfect capital mobility. Capital mobility, and the capital can move inside or outside the country freely. There is no restrictions on the international trade in assets, and the economy is small, as we mentioned at the beginning of the chapter, that cannot affect the world interest rate because it is a small in this model. And by the way, we denoted the world interest rate by R star. As we know, R is for the local interest rate and the R star is for the world interest rate, which is also the exogenous variable, as we will see in the next slide. So the investment, which is the demand for loanable funds, the companies, the firms that demand loans. So it is the demand curve, as we can see here. The investment is still downward sloping function of the interest rate, as as we said, when the interest rate decreases in the vertical axis, the investment increases. because the interest rate, as we said, is the price or the cost of the investment. When you take a loan, so you pay an interest. When this interest rate increase, so you will demand less funds, so the investment will decrease. So we can see the negative relationship between the interest rate and the investment. But for the new exogenous variable, which is the world interest rate, R star in red here, that determines the country's level of investment, as we will see. So if the economy were closed, as we see in the third chapter, we can see here from this graph the interest rate in the vertical axis and the saving and investment in the horizontal axis. We have also the curves, the supply and demand curve. Supply is for savings, this vertical curve, and the investment curve or the demand curve for investment, which is a function of the interest rate or determined by the interest rate. So the interest rate would adjust in this closed economy, will adjust or change or move, increase and decrease to equate the investment and the saving, to make the investment and saving to be equal, as we saw in the closed economy, because there is no other sources for funds. Only the companies or the firms can demand funds from the savings or of the other individuals. So the interest rate will still moves till this point, as we can see here, will adjust to equate the investment and the saving to the point of RC. So this will be the equilibrium interest rate and determine the amount of the investment in the local economy, which will be equal to the savings. But in an open economy, our model for the small open economy, there is another exogenous variable, as we said, which is the world interest rate, which determines the investment. As we see, now we are talking about an open economy. There is international trade and free mobility of capital and so on. So in this case, the difference, before moving to this, we can see here the investment is determined by the R star or the world interest rate, not like the closed economy. It was here in the intersection between the two curves. No, in this case, it's moved to left according to the world interest rate. Then we have the difference between saving and investments in this case, which is also determines the net capital outflows, which is the difference between saving and investment, and the net exports, the difference between exports and imports. So according to these concepts, we have three experiments: the fiscal policy at home, the fiscal policy abroad, and the increase in investment demand. When we talk about the fiscal policy, we talk about the government spending and taxes and so on, how the country determine these variables, the increase or decrease the taxes or the government spending. We will see how this determines these variables at home in the local country or abroad in the foreign countries, and also what happens when the increase or the demand for investment increases. The first case, the fiscal policy at home. As you can see here, also the same curves of the supply and demand of funds, the savings, and the investments. We can see here the investment according to the world interest rate, which is R1. Okay, and the difference between them, or the net capital outflow, and which is the same, the net exports or NX1, the difference between S and I. So any increase in the government spending or decrease in the taxes, this makes what yani, this is like when the government spend more or decrease the taxes, so the government will receive less than before, so the savings will reduce. So what happened in this case? The savings will move to the left because the savings reduced because of the increase of the government spending and the decrease in the taxes. Okay, so this results of two things. First, the change in investments, as we see here, I1 on the horizontal axis, will not change. Only the saving will change. So the change in I investment will equal 0. There is no change. And the change in NX or net exports, as you can see, it changed from NX1 to NX2, will equal also the change in the savings, the difference between S1 and S2, which is less than 0. Less than 0 doesn't mean that the saving or the net export will be less than 0. No, the change in the net exports and the change in savings will be less than 0, which means that it will be negative or by minus. Yani it will reduce or be less. So to explain this, in the small open economy, the fixed world interest rate bends down the value of the investment, regardless of the fiscal policy changes. Thus, $1 decrease in the saving causes a $1 decrease in the net export and the net capital flow. You have to note that the analysis on this slide applies on anything that causes a decrease in savings, not only the government spending and taxes and so on, but for example, مثلا, a shift in consumer preferences. Consumers have preferences, maybe they change by time. Regarding to the trade-off between saving and consumption, you can imagine if you are a consumer, you have some money, you may consume or spend this money or save this money. It's according to the consumer preferences, what you prefer. For example, at this time of this crisis or coronavirus circumstances and so on, consumer preferences may change. At the beginning of the crisis, for example, which means in the short run, the consumers start to spend more money. They go to the shops and the supermarkets and so on, start to buy a lot of products and store them at house and so on, because they have some information that the magazines will be closed and so on, or the products will be will not be available anymore because there is a lot of consumption. So at the short run, they start to spend more money to buy product and store them. But after 1 week, 2 weeks, or 1 month, they consider that this crisis may last for a long time, or they may stay at home and lose their jobs and have wage cut. So they start to decrease their spending of money and start to thinking about saving money. So in the short run, the consumer preferences were to spend more money, and but in the long run, they start to change their preferences to save more money because they don't know what will happen in the future. Okay, our model also generates a prediction that the government's budget deficit and the country's trade balance should be negatively related. As we know, the country's trade balance is the difference between the exports and the imports, and the budget deficit or budget surplus is according to the spending of the government. It is more or less, and also the taxes, revenues, and so on. So they are negatively related. How? We can see this from this chart. The net exports and the federal budget deficit in the United States as a percentage of the GDP in these several years. We can see the budget deficit curve is increasing upwards. Maybe there is some fluctuations in the short run, but in the long run, it is increasing upwards. And negatively, we can see this curve of the net exports, which is a sloping downwards for the long run. This is for the fiscal policy at home. What about the fiscal policy abroad? How can the fiscal policy abroad in the other foreign countries and the world economy affect the trade balance and the net capital flow? As we can see here, Bardo, in our graph of the supply curve and demand curve for saving and investment, we have also this exogenous variable, the world interest rate, that determines the amount of the investment. And the difference between saving and investment is the net capital flow or the net exports. So the expansionary fiscal policy also abroad, the government spending and the taxes, any change in this fiscal policy abroad raises the world interest rate. As you can see, the world interest rate here raises upward. So what happens in this case? You can see the investment will decrease. As we know, when the interest rate increase, the investment will decrease. And the net exports also will decrease, or the net capital outflow. So the results of this change in the fiscal policy abroad, and which raises the world interest rate, results for the change in the investment rate, which is less than zero, and the change also in the net exports, as we see in the graph. So according to this figure, it explains that the world interest rate is determined by saving and investment in the world loanable funds market. So the world savings is the sum of the country's savings, and the investment, or the world investment, is the sum of all countries' investments. And the world interest rate adjusts also to equate the world investment and world saving, just like we saw in the chapter 3 in the closed economy. But why? We are now talking about an open economy. But because the world as a whole is considered a closed economy also. So physical expansion in other countries would reduce the world savings and raise the world interest rate. So the higher world interest rate reduces the investment in our small open economy, and hence reduces the demand for loanable funds, reduces the demand for investment. The supply of loanable funds, or the national savings, is unchanged, so there is an increase in the amount of funds flowing abroad. The third experiment is an increase in investment demand. If the demand for investment increases, what happens in this case? We can see in this graph here the new position of the I1, or investment rate, that determined by the world interest rate, and the difference between this investment and saving, the NX1. You can think about it. You can pause the video and think about this exercise. Use the model to, according to the concepts that we explained earlier, determine the impact of an increase in investment demand. If the investment demand, when we see the investment demand, we are talking about the investment curve. Okay. If there is an increase in the investment demand, what happens, or how can this determine or impact the net exports, the difference between saving and investment, and the national saving and the national investment, and the net capital outflow. Okay, you can pause the video and think about it, and I'll talk about it now. Okay, when we change, or the demand for investment in this curve, as you can see, changes to the right, and the demand for investment increases. Now we are not talking about the amount of investments that determined by the world interest rates. No, maybe there is another causes, reasons that make the demand for investment increase. So this makes the change not only by the position of the investment on the horizontal axis will change to the right or left. No, the whole investment curve or demand curve for investment will shift to the right. What happened in this case? We can see many changes. First, the investment in the local economy will increase because it's a move to this point on the right, and the net exports will decrease as the difference between saving and investment will be decreased. You can see the difference between NX1 and NX2. So we can see that the change in investment will be more than zero because it is positive change. Yani the investment will increase. The change in savings will equal zero as it is. The savings here is fixed. There is no change because it's determined by the amount of income and consumption and spending. And the net capital outflow, which is the same as the net exports, falls or reduced by the amount change of the investments. As you can see, the difference between NX1 and NX2. So in contrast to the closed economy, investment is not constrained by fixed or domestic supply of loanable funds. Hence, the increase in firms' demand for loanable funds can be satisfied by borrowing abroad, which reduces the net outflow of financial capital. And since the net capital outflow equals the net exports, we see a fall in the net exports equal to the increase in investment. This is the explanation of this graph, as you can read any time. So now we finished this section. Let's summarize it quickly. The impact of any policy on the trade balance can be determined by examining its impact on saving and investment. As we saw, it's very related. Also, the policies that raise the saving or lower the investment lead to a trade surplus, and the policies that lower saving or raise investment lead to a trade deficit. So this is the conclusion of this section, and we will continue, inshallah, our chapter next lesson and finalize it by the we will see the how by the exchange rates determines also the trade balance and the net capital outflow. We will see this in the next section and next lesson, inshallah. Okay, see you. Goodbye and good luck.